Tool, to all of you who are here in the Centennial Complex, and to those who are with us from Zoom, and to those who will be with us on Facebook, and to those who will be with us on YouTube. Welcome to all of you from New Zealand to Norway. No one through Asia, but from New Zealand to Norway. Thank you for all being here. This is our first day back in the Centennial Complex, and we knew there would be some uncertain complications, and there have been. And I'm not quite sure how we're going to resolve them, but later on for that. Today, we're happy that Professor Alex Dubov is with us, and he is from Ukraine. He's also, as I indicated in the letter I sent out, I think one of the top 3 or 4, maybe the top first researcher, empirical type of researcher in biomedical ethics. When he was applying here, I was in Roy Branson's office just chatting, as we often did, and he gave me Alex's CV. And he asked me, well, what do you think about this? And I took a few moments and I read through it and I said, this is a prank. This is a joke. Nobody has published that much. And so
as a student,
you know, even as not a student, and he said, I think you're right. This is, I should not take this seriously because it is a joke. Well, it wasn't a joke. Alex had indeed published that much. He's extraordinarily effective at getting grants and industrious at that. His accomplishments are quite extraordinary. So we're very lucky to have Alex here at Loma. And we are also lucky that we can hear from him about Ukraine. Now I've asked Judith Whitehouse to read from Paul and his speech to the Athenians from Mars Hill. Let me just say a word about this. The reason we usually read this passage is not the reason for which we're going to do so today. We usually read it about how Paul was relating to the deities of the Asian Empire. I'm looking at a New Testament scholar here, Dr. Leo Rensland, so I'm moving carefully. But when Paul says in this speech that God has appointed the boundaries for each nation, that's an interesting idea. I think one could understand that in 2 different ways. I'm not sure what Paul had in mind, but one way would be for Paul to be saying, all the boundaries for all the nations that now exist are precisely as God wants them to be. Now Paul was a Roman, and his Roman his affection for Rome shows through at a number of different places. And it's possible that that's what he meant, that all the boundaries established by the Roman Empire were the ones that God had ordained. There's another way to read that, though, and that is to say that God has established the principle that each cultural group should have its own territory, and that should not be invaded by any other group. That, I think, is how I would understand it. I hope that's what Paul had in mind. He may well have, but I think the idea that each family in the families of nations should have a place that it calls home, and that no one should invade that home any more than anyone should invade any of our domestic homes. So that, I think, it's a very powerful thing, and I've asked Judith to read it for us with very short notice, so thank you very much.
While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he argued in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and also in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Also, some Epicureans and Stoic philosophers debated with him. Some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign divinities." This was because he was telling the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So they took him and brought him to the Areopagus and asked him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? It sounds rather strange to us, so we would like to know what it means." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners living there would spend their time in nothing but telling or hearing something new. Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor, he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, quote, for we too are his offspring, unquote. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone or an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance now, he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given us assurance to all by raising him from the dead. When they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some scoffed, but others said, we will hear you again about this. At that point, Paul left them, but some of them joined him and became believers, including Dionysius, the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them.
Thank you so much. Let's pray. Dear God, we have no better definition of you than being the one in whom and by whom we live and move and have our being. But today we contemplate not that, but the whole issue of boundaries and ethnic homes and the safety of people and the protection from those who would invade and destroy and leave in desolation once prosperous and flourishing cities and towns, villages and farms. We're thankful for Alex, whose life has been such that we can benefit from him in this way today, as we have in so many other ways over the years. In Christ's name, amen. Well, Alex, we're here. And you're just barely here.
Just barely here.
Because you came in from your holiday, I think.
Yeah, I was just 2 weeks away. So I was with another part of the family in South Africa. So just came back from South Africa. So I'm still a little bit recovering from the jet lag. I came on Thursday night. So it's been a day after 30 plus hours of flying. So yeah, so it's a long flight.
Thank you for being here.
No,
we tried to schedule this so this wouldn't happen. We thought at one time you might do this from Africa.
Right.
But then we thought, no, that would be too stressful. We might have scheduled this a week later than we did, but here you are. I'm glad you were here. You had a good time in Africa?
Yes. The highlight was Kruger Park. I managed to be on the nature. I think that's the most healing part about it, you know, to see animals I saw up close, and it's something that that cannot be expressed really. When you see giraffes and zebras, like even like a leopard was just right next to the car, and so they in Africa they call it the big five. So it's kind of your goal to see the big five: the buffalo, the lion, leopard, elephant, and so rhinoceros. So and I've seen, and it was said about rhinoceros. I saw one, and most of them have no horns now. So it's kind of weird to see the one that just they removed it from to prevent poaching. So it's kind of sad. You see rhinoceros, but you better recognize because there is no horn.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
No hippopotami?
No, I saw them too. Wow.
I've read that they're the most vicious animals out there.
Yes, so you better stay away, and you better stay in your car. You better never leave. It's some people forget about that and jump out and take pictures, forget somehow that it's not tamed animals, and so the accidents happen quite often there. And locals somehow say, well, we're not even sorry because there's huge signs everywhere. Stay in your car. So
on YouTube, there's a video of a lion making the mistake of approaching one of those, and it just seizes its midriff in its hands and just throws it up in the air. And the lion lands and runs, feeling good to get away. So, okay, let's talk about Ukraine and your family there. You have some relatives still there. Well, first of all, when did you come to this country?
So I came to this country about 15 years ago, I would say. So I came to Andrews University to do my Master in Divinity. They had this program where they would support international students coming to do MDiv. That's how I ended up coming to the US. And from Andrews, I done my chaplaincy work. Through the chaplaincy, I got interested in bioethics because my supervisor at the time was also head of the bioethics committee. I got exposed. I was at Emory University, and Emory University, you probably know, it's like one of the in the South, kind of like central hub where when other hospitals don't know how to deal with their cases, they will bring it to Emory. So its case mix is quite high there. The severity of patients and the situations that you deal with, it's very unique. So it exposed me to a lot of interesting ethical questions, and I wondered, I didn't know what bioethics existed at the time, so I wanted to study more, so I applied. At the time, there were not many PhD programs in bioethics specifically, so I managed to get into one. And so that's how my journey through bioethics, and then some work in the hospital, work in Florida Celebration Hospital, helping them establish bioethics consults. I had a postdoc program at Yale where I got interested in public health, and I actually ended up doing some work in Ukraine through Yale and through my mentor, which was presented to the Ministry of Health. So it was I was actually for a year USAID consultant for Ukraine on a project, and so we managed to, at the time they were introducing new prevention methods, and we managed to inform the program Ministry of Health how to introduce it in a way that it reaches the population most at risks and actually gets uptake, because sometimes we have a lot of evidence-based methods that not really used by populations who need to use them because we not optimize the programs in the way they should be. So I worked in Ukraine as well in that capacity, and I think after that I came here to Loma. So that was my journey so far.
Do you remember what your first grant was for?
Yes, so that was actually my first grant. It was in when I was at Yale, and it was to do the prevention work in HIV. I think somebody's not muted. Okay. So at the time, there was a new pill that just came out to prevent HIV. And with the whole history, there was a lot of ethical questions with it as well, because there is this pill you can give to people, and no matter what they do, they will not contract HIV. But the history of the pill also mirrored a lot of the history of contraception. There were similar objections. Well, what if we give these people this pill, this method, and they will do crazy things? Should we encourage them to do this behavior, or should we just give them because the cost of HIV is so high? And how do you prioritize who we give it first? So that was my first. Ukraine was planning to introduce this pill because it's number 2 epidemic in Europe. Number 1 is Russia. So, but the prevalence is very high in Ukraine, and so they try to control it. And so there are big hopes that these methods of control will help to stem the epidemic. So the grant was to use input from high-risk people to figure out how to best deliver it to them in a way that they would take it, that they will use it, that they will be compliant, because a lot of that was based on the compliance of people. It's not enough to take it once, you have to take it daily. And so how do we make it in a way that they take it and use it? So that was my first grant. Working in Ukraine, and I've done similar work in the US as well, trying to introduce prevention method, but also studying bioethical. But it was a lot of interesting bioethical questions related to this whole new prevention methods, and who should take it, should we give it, is it what are moral implications of it? So that was my first grant.
Well, you developed an app, I think.
Yes. So the app. I worked also and still working on it. We just pilot tested the first app for suicide prevention, and specifically we try to think about several populations where suicidality is high. One would be veterans, but one is even higher. It's transgender people. So among transgender people, suicidality is about 40%, which is in general population is 4%. No, actually less than 2%. So it's more than 10 times higher rates of suicidality among transgender people. And for example, for a Black transgender woman, a life expectancy is about 35, 37 years. So even though we understand potentially why there's such a high rates of suicidality, we don't really know the exact pathway that leads them to commit suicide. So I developed an app as a resource for them, but also as a way to almost collect longitudinal data, where by brief journaling, we would get a lot of data to basically using artificial intelligence and machine learning to analyze this data and basically have a predictive model of suicidality, where we would know. So for example, if this is this entry, the next entry will be even worse, the next entry will be even worse. So we can intervene early in a sequence of events leading to the suicide. So that was the intent of the app, to provide resources and to help, connect them to services, and but also to understand better what exact model, like to create a model of suicidality and create an actionable kind of interventions that based on that model.
Good, just a second. I'm going to move this one way or the other to see if we can get more of you in. That's the wrong way. No, wait.
It's good.
No, I think I moved it the wrong way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. We get to see more of you that way. Good. Now, what's your last grant? We've talked about, the first, and now let's hear about the last.
There are 2 last grants. One I'm working on now, and one that was scored high and went all the way up to NIH Council, but has to be resubmitted with comments. Those who are familiar with the NIH grants know that it's usually like 10% success rate. But it's nice to at least get a good score and the submission. So one is I'm still working with minority populations and HIV, because that's where I started, and that's where my work kind of leads me. So one, we're working in emergency department now, trying to capture Latino population, Latino patients who are at risk of both substance use and HIV. Because in our area here in San Bernardino, I don't know if you know, but we a top priority county for HIV rates. So recently there was this initiative called Ending the HIV Epidemic. It was a presidential initiative. They identified out of 3,000 counties in the US, 3,008 counties, there are only 42 counties, I believe, where more than 50% of all new cases come of HIV. So basically the idea, if we would target those hot spots, we can stop the epidemic. And so San Bernardino, Riverside, Orange County, LA County, San Diego County, we all those hotspots. But even comparing in between those hotspots, San Bernardino, where everywhere else the epidemic goes down, the numbers slowly go down of new infections. In San Bernardino, they're rising. So which we don't want to see that. That's usually a really bad trend. And it's rising potentially because, first of all, the epidemic also mostly among people of color. So 80% of new cases happen among Latino and African Americans. And there is also syndemic between substance use and HIV. So these two go together. We know that this area is a meth capital of the world. Unfortunately, San Bernardino area and Riverside area. And so the Latino community is very affected by both. And the problem with this community that they also don't talk about, neither of that. So we created, and there is a California mandate to screen people in emergency departments. So to test them so we can find new cases and put them in treatment. But we don't have a reliable mechanism in the emergency department here. So we created an Mhealth Tool, so like a tablet tool where people can self-screen themselves, answering those sensitive questions where there is no person who asks them directly. And we use community health workers who kind of facilitate this intervention, so it's more culturally appropriate. And they also serve as a link when we need to connect these people to services. So community health workers are trained to provide tests, to connect them to services, schedule appointment, follow-ups. So we try to make sure that in our emergency department, we can find people who have those needs, address them in a more culturally appropriate way, and connect them to services. That's one way. And the other grant, somebody's also not muted again. The other grant, just a second, let's see who should be muted. Okay, I think we're good. So the other grant is similar, but in the primary care. So we're trying to also to make sure that in primary care, providers don't have enough time to address this topic. So how do we help primary care providers to also find those people who may need these services, connect them to services? And yeah, so those are two grants I'm working on.
Thank you so much. I haven't forgotten the question about how your family's doing, but I'd like to go back, do a little more background, and tell us about your life in Ukraine before you came here. And I've been corrected because I used to say the Ukraine. I don't know where I picked that up, but one of my students from Ukraine said, no, you don't say the California, you say California.
Well, it was correct up until 1991 when Ukraine was part of USSR. So then you could say the Ukraine because it was part of a collection of republics. But since it became independent state, yeah, so we dropped that since 1991 because it's independent country. Well, yeah, so I grew up in Poltava. It's a kind of cultural hub of Ukraine where a lot of painters and writers, like for example, if you know Gogol, Gogol is from Poltava. Pushkin it's Russian, but he was quite often there. So a lot of famous writers, especially Ukrainian writers, they kind of all came from that city. The city is close to Kharkiv, and Kharkiv is on the border of Russia. It's the second largest city. So my life in Ukraine up until 17-year-old, I went to school there. Through my health issues, my mom found Seventh Adventist Church. We became part of it even during the communism. I remember the baptism where it has to be at night on the river in very hushed tones. So I remember like the choir was trying to sing, but they also were like singing in like whispers. So it was very interesting. I joined the church early on. I grew up in the church, and since I grew up, my father left us, and my mom had to raise two kids. So pretty much I was raised by the church, because there was like a schedule who would watch me among the church members. We're a small community, small family kind of. So
they were well organized.
They were well organized. And as I think it's, what you can see now, it's characteristic of all Ukrainians. During the war, what happens now with the war, I'm so amazed to see how people, even like on the West, where people migrating, people open their houses to complete strangers. They take people in, and there's a lot of solidarity. There's a lot of communal sense. It's not only limited to church, it's also kind of almost a national feature where people are very welcoming and very kind of take care of each other, basically.
I tried to read a little history of Ukraine from the beginnings of prehistory to the present, and I found it somewhat dispiriting because it seemed to me that Ukraine was invaded by any number of people over the centuries. It must be very valuable land because everybody seems to want it. All the countries around it have invaded it, and when they invade it, they often try to suppress the Ukrainian culture, and the first way they do that is to prohibit the language. And that's a good way. I saw that in Hawaii. That's a good way to kill a culture, is to deny them the language. And I don't know of Ukraine invading other nations. There probably should have been at least a time when it did.
No, what we tried to do historically, there was only one time we had Cossacks who were very famous fighters, but they were not necessarily invading. They were mostly fighting against Turks who were trying to invade Ukraine, and they were quite successful. Usually Turkish army was, and still is, and at the time was one of the biggest, so Cossacks were famous for, not invading, but fighting Turkish army. But yeah, we a peaceful nation and very much agrarian nation, not very much agrarian. We have other also, we're a rich nation in terms of production of different ores and metallurgical kind of factories, and like steel and some coal, and you name it. But I think the most famous, what we were famous for, we called during the Soviet Union breadbasket of not only USSR, but I think pretty much the Eurasia, and it's still very much true. Under the recent estimates, I think Ukraine fits about 400 million people in the world. So one of the complications of this war would be the disruption and world famine resulting from inability, if Ukrainian farmers are not able to use the land, which they may not. Now it's kind of the time to start. That the famine and disruption in production of grain and other produces that will have major implications throughout the world. So Ukraine is very famous for that. But yeah, there is a long history. I can give very brief history of how Ukraine started. So it started in 11th century, actually in 10th century, with Vikings. Vikings were trying to find a way south from where they used to be. And so they found the way south through the river Dnieper, It's a long river that's, goes through Ukraine, and they found a transient post that was Kiev. They settled there, and they used that as their hub. They also understood the importance of a religion at the time, and Ukrainians were at the time approached by several religions, including Islam and Judaism, but early on they converted to Christianity with Vikings, and so that's helped to build beautiful churches and beautiful cities. So Russian state actually started in Ukraine. So for the longest time, the state was called Kiev Rus, or Kiev's Russia and Kiev, basically. So Russia did start in Kiev. Moscow didn't exist for the next 4 centuries. So Moscow started way later during the Mongolian invasion and past the Mongolian invasion. And so since then, after the Mongolian invasion, we used to be part of many different Latvian first Latvian kingdom, then it was Poland kingdom, and then finally in 1917 there was this hope that will become independent state, but 1917 was also the time when Bolsheviks took over, and we joined with many other republics the USSR, created by Lenin. That's where the claim, I don't know if you heard the claim by Putin, that Lenin created Ukraine. Ukraine existed way before Lenin. It was a rich history and he didn't create it. Or Russia created Ukraine. So at the time, Russia didn't exist. The USSR exists. The USSR is very different from Russia. USSR was a collection of different republics that joined together. In the beginning of that time, the Ukrainian actually language for the first couple of 5 years, there was a lot of interest from Bolsheviks and to join and to have the resources. So their language and culture was encouraged. But then you have to kind of think of the 1917 as the time where it was a lot of poor peasant people who just got away from the Tsar. So they had no resources, no capital, and they wanted to be industrialized nation. One way to be industrialized is to have capital, and capital comes through produces. So Ukraine was the one making those produces, a lot of grain. So that's where the Stalin's policy of collectivization came in. So he wanted to basically seize from the private farms to collectivize them and seize all the grain to have a capital to then build factories and whatever else was needed to create actually a state. So he tried to collectivize that. His policy failed miserably, but it was also blamed on farmers, on Ukrainians. So it resulted in a lot of elite people who are intelligentsia were executed because they were presented as opposing his policies, and Ukrainians were starved. So the grain was, and every producers were taken by force, and resulted in about 3.9 million people starved to death during the 2 years. So that was the first time where the complicated history of Russia and Ukraine started with this forceful policy of removing all the producers and starving people to death. And when you starve people to death, even afterwards, you basically eliminated the whole population of people. The people who, especially churches, were targeted because churches at the time served as and even now they serve as a place where people would come for help. And so churches were trying to help people, and so the churches were first targeted by Stalin to remove, and that resulted in a lot of suppression of Ukrainian language, culture, and basically destruction of Ukraine in the beginning. There was a small period of time. Oh, and then Second World War started, and Ukraine was the country that suffered the most harm from the war. So Ukrainian fighters were pretty much the ones who fought Germany, and on our grounds, victory was kind of started to form. We suffered the most casualties in the war, but then after the war, even though Stalin essentially praised Ukraine for helping to win the war because we were so actively participating in it, since Hitler had a lot of prisoners in Ukraine, they were immediately considered as the informants or collaborators with the West. And so there was a second wave of repression from Stalin, taking all those people who were captured first by Germany, now they were captured by Russia again. So that also, there was a second wave of kind of removing language and culture and people who just recovered from one war to go to gulags. And then there was a brief period of time when, the culture and state was kind of encouraged to flourish in the 60s. It was only lasted for 10 years. And then in the 70s, that's where Brezhnev came. And Brezhnev had this strong policy of Russification. So he was very keen on that everybody has to speak the same language. The country has to be uniform. USSR has to be uniform. So he had this policy of moving people around, so people from Kazakhstan would move to Ukraine, Ukrainian people would go to Kazakhstan. So there was a lot of, for the idea of like speaking the same language and having kind of this uniformity. And this is the time also when Putin was born and raised. So he probably raised on the same kind of ideas of Russification and Russian culture, Russian language being, the most important thing. And so that was this kind of third wave where Ukrainian identity and language and culture was, suppressed severely. So there are many, attempts through the history. This is not but what I'm trying to say, this is not the first time we've seen this war, that's been ongoing kind of history in Ukraine since 1970, for at least 100 years, and then even more. Yeah.
The correlation between that mass starvation, virtually 4 million people, even now Ukraine has what, 40 million people?
42, yes.
So that's a quarter of the population slowly starving to death.
Yes.
And that's directly related to totalitarian socialism.
Right. It was those 2 years were one of the most productive years. There was plenty of grain. It was just removed. People were prohibited from the rural villages to go to the city. They were prohibited to beg. They were prohibited to leave the country. So there was nowhere to go. It was kind of like on lockdown, and everything was taken away. So people were eating dirt, and they were just slowly dying. So it was basically manufactured genocide.
And if Ukraine would become under Russia again, that philosophy of totalitarian socialism would come back to Ukraine, right?
Yes, very much so, judging by the fact that most of the destroyed objects right now in Ukraine, if you see what's targeted now, it's a civilian objects like hospitals, schools, maternity hospitals. And, if there will be an interest, so sometimes people think maybe Russia is interested in using the resources that we have in Ukraine, but if that would be true, they would not target factories, important factories that we have, because the idea would be like you can use them if you occupy the place, right? But they, for example, just recently destroyed one of the biggest metallurgical factory in Mariupol, completely destroyed it. And there was a huge production of, it was one of the most important factories probably we had in Ukraine. So the idea would be if that would be the goal, just to occupy and use the resources, they would not do what they do now. So the idea is just systematic destruction.
So there are really deep cultural differences, but also deep philosophical difference, political philosophy differences that cause the people of Ukraine to be very vigorous in defending their way of life.
Right. Yeah. So I think what drives this war is very different approach to the way Russia operates and been operating for the last 20, 30 years with Putin versus what we see in Ukraine, and very much a threat to the regime that Putin has in Russia. So imagine in Russia, there is one person who controls literally everything. He controls the press, he controls the courts, he controls the government, judicial branch. Everything is controlled by one person. And so even though it sounds like a lot of power, but it also, like all these tyrannies, they're also strong, but also fragile, because people understand, that you live in a place that is not real, that's, the courts are not real, the government is not real, all this, it's only performance, because ultimately it all goes to one person who decides everything. So where they live, it's not real. And people sensing that, they also want something more real, where they have representation and voice, but that's been heavily suppressed for the longest time in many different ways, versus Ukraine has completely different approach. Since the beginning, we were a democracy, and we had twice managed to remove the government and overthrow the government. So recently, the most recent one was in 2014, where we had somebody who was put by Russia and controlled by Russia, the president, and everybody was public knowledge, everybody knew it. He was an oligarch with a palace, in a palace when he was forced to flee the country. Now the palace is open for people to visit, and and you can find in the palace there's a golden toilet. There is for some weird reason there is a golden loaf of bread. So it was that kind of same model that works in Russia of oligarchy. He was one of those, but peacefully Ukrainians went in millions, and I had some videos I wanted to show you. But we were successful to remove and put somebody we had trust in. So that model, and it kind of threatens the whole idea of Russia and Russian state and Putin's grip on power, because everybody can see that, there is another way, like neighboring country that also speaks Russian can function very differently, and it works. And so there were several protests in Russia in several people who challenged Putin, and having a neighbor country that is democratic, it's the biggest challenge to Putin regime. So one of the main reasons he started this war was to suppress that. He cannot allow a democracy and functioning democracy to be right next door. And so, there is no democracy in Belarus, and so he's fine with that. And Ukraine is the only one that is different. So it cannot be. And so one of the reasons, you can see that the war started in 2014, and the war started right after we were able to oust the president. And that's when the Crimea invasion happened, and that's when the other invasions happened, as the direct response to our ability to say no and to have a democratic election.
Wonderful. Now we've established some background. Let's take a break. And when we take a break, we'll more particularly look at recent events, beginning with your family, and also the work that you're doing in Southern California in different ways for the people of Ukraine. So we have a lot to discuss regarding the specific situation just now. Let's take a break. Some people have to go to second church, but we will reconvene as closely to 11:40 as we can, but it's already that time. So we're not going to do that. So we go to what, 11:55, something like that? 11:50, 11:50. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Alex. So thank you, everybody. We have quite a few people on Zoom, and Alex's suggestion is that if you have a question or a comment, that you type it in to the chat section, and he's going to be watching the chats and he can respond to that. There is one from Dr. Tishi that you might want to respond to about the Slavic people.
Oh yeah, there was a question about basically starting with Hitler and then Putin hating the Slavs, and under the Hitler there was this agenda to eliminate the Slavs. But somebody pointed out in the chat that both Russians and Ukrainians are Slavs. But there is a little bit of truth to that comment. Even though we're both Slavs, the perception, and it's still a perception in Russia, it started with still Tsars and emperors, that Ukraine was, they call it Malo Russia, so or like Little Russia, so like something that adjacent to Russia. And there was this running narrative that Ukrainians are less in many regards. They're peasants, farmers, half-wit, they uncultured, they dirty. And so that narrative prevailed up until this time. And I think this is one of the issues why Putin's campaign is not going so well, because he still lives with that narrative of Ukrainians being half dumb, half wit, and farmers. And so he didn't expect so much resistance, thinking, in that still imperial mindset that, the Ukraine will just collapse immediately, because there is this hate. It's not necessarily hate, it's more of like perception of a lesser, with sometimes what happens here in the US with the minorities. When we look at the minorities, and we automatically have this bias, assuming that, they less eloquent, they less something, that the same kind of idea was assigned to Ukrainians by Russia. And so that hate and that bias comes from, from histories and histories of thinking of Ukraine as an appendix to Russia, and people being, less so, kind of less cultured, dirty, peasants, you name it.
You have some videos for us?
Oh, yes, I wanted to, I didn't have any presentations, but maybe through videos, and this is public videos, public knowledge. I wanted to first maybe to show how Ukraine used to look like, because I think in a lot of people, not many people actually knew about Ukraine before this all happened. And I noticed when I talk about Ukraine, in some people's perception, Ukraine is more of agrarian state. You think a lot of tractors and farmers, but it's not necessarily so. We had beautiful cities. It's a well-developed country. It's a European country. So there is this video I show. It was actually produced by the president, Ukraine, and he starts with this idea showing the cities and how the country looked like. So I can add, both videos are like several videos I have. They're all like 1 or 2 minute long, and I grabbed them from Instagram, not Instagram, the Twitter account. So so it's public knowledge, so there's no copyright. Oh, got it. Yeah, somebody has to. Probably.
Let's see.
It's, I think it's on there. Yeah, go.
Dana says, I've visited Kyiv in 2001 and loved it. Absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, and since then, Kyiv developed even more. We had, if you visited probably in those times, first maybe decade after the fall of communism in USSR, it was quite difficult times where we had to establish our own, from scratch, our own, country, our own budgets. Like, for example, I remember we had rubles in Soviet Union, and then when Soviet Union ceased to exist, we had no money. We had nothing in the stores because all the chains of supplies were lost. We basically had nothing. So I remember going to the store, and it was funny. We had A4 printouts, and you come and they cut out with scissors, like a coupons, to pay, because so those first 10 years, were very formative and difficult. But, if you visited Kyiv now, Kyiv is actually really beautiful. There's a lot of history, and it's a beautiful city. And we have a few other cities that are just as beautiful. And since 2000s, if you visited in 2010 and past it, it's redeveloped as a beautiful country. So let me. Oh, maybe. Not yet.
Can you hear us now? Yeah.
Yes, but with lots of echo.
Were you able to hear the conversation? How's that?
Can you hear us?
That's good now.
That's good now, yeah.
Perfect.
Excellent.
Thank you. Did you hear any of the interview?
Yeah, from the video?
Yeah, no, from my questions to Alex, did you hear any of that?
before, not in the last 2 minutes.
Oh,
Okay, so we're all right then.
yeah, all right.
Okay, so back to videos.
So I just, I wanted to, this is just to show the country, you know.
The sound cut out again.
Oh,
So every time I mute this one, it goes out.
yeah, that's fine. It's just it's just a brief video of what the country looked like as a promotion. I think, yeah, I think if we'll talk into that one. So yeah, so I think the reason why I wanted to show that is to show that Ukraine was a little bit more than just, you know, an agrarian small country. It's a second largest country in Europe. It's founded in the center of Europe. It's first largest by size. And it has, I don't know if you could see like from the videos, it had a lot of beautiful cities. It had a lot of natural resources that are, you know, parks and, you know, the areas that are just gorgeous. So it's a little bit more than just agrarian, tiny, small state that some people may have an impression. So yeah, so I think that's
it?
yeah.
Okay, so we don't need that. Okay.
I think, yeah, I mean, we're good to
Just
no, yeah, we can, don't leave the meeting here with this where they hear us. So I think we, no, don't.
Everything's fine?
So everything's
But
fine.
how can we get rid of that?
Off.
I just want to look at it.
Oh, the view here. Like this?
Yeah, although they were saying they like it on speaker.
But I think they can probably hear us.
It's good now. We can see you and hear you.
Yeah. I think they were all good.
How about now? Can you hear and see us both?
Oh, it's great.
Yeah.
All right. Let me ask Alex this. Is there anything you want to say and you would feel disappointed that you didn't have a chance to say before we quit? Let's start there and then come back. You know, you've worked, I don't want to put thoughts or ideas in your mind. What would you like us to hear? People in this room, but also people on Zoom and people on Facebook and people on YouTube.
I don't know if I really have something that I not necessarily want to share as more than that I want to mention that there is a lot of misinformation. If you know something about Russia, Russia is very effective in spreading misinformation, including in this country as well. It happened during the past elections. Russia perfected through years, you know, PSYOP and, you know, through the years of KGB and they doing it now quite successfully up to the point, you know, there are a lot of people asking me questions that I can see are informed in some way by Russian propaganda, which people, it's not somebody's fault. It just shows how effective Russian propaganda is. And so maybe instead of me mentioning something, that I think there will be a good point to maybe answering questions or mention things that are was part of the Russian propaganda that not necessarily true. So to make sure that people have a better perspective, a right perspective on this war and why it happens, and not informed by, you know, the sources of propaganda, which unfortunately, especially with the social media, are quite prevalent.
So if I understand you correctly, you'd like to respond to some questions?
Right.
Okay, those on Zoom, let's see if we can hear a question in verbal form. Bob, do you have a question or comment? Either one. How about unmuting yourself and let's hear you?
Oh, there's a question about my family.
Yeah. Let's hear from Bob. I want to see if we can hear Bob.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
that works.
No,
Do you have
no,
a comment?
No, I'm sorry. I wasn't able to listen to the first hour. Was somewhere else, so I'm not following everything. I would just offer say that, and I'm sure that your speaker mentioned this, that we need to distinguish between what's happening in some cases at the political level and what's happening at the people level, at the family level, on both sides, you know, in both Ukraine and Russia. I find myself, I think you know, my daughter-in-law is Russian. Her mother still lives in St. Petersburg, and what we hear, it's very hard to hear things right now, but there are differences. So trying to get past this propaganda network that is just being talked about is very difficult. So we just need to be very careful about jumping to conclusions about everything and just try to get multiple facts and be careful about what we say. Particularly when you have family involved, it becomes a very difficult issue. Yeah.
I would agree with that, but I think when the cities are systematically destroyed and lives are lost, and schools and maternity hospitals and are targeted, I think there cannot be plurality of opinion, just like shouldn't be any plurality of opinion during the Second World War. If evil is happening, regardless of people being misled about it, it has to be named and position have to be taken, because not taking a position is also taking a position.
Yeah.
And there was this, I think it's Einstein said that world will be destroyed not by people doing evil, but by people who watch and do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
I think you misunderstood me. No, I agree with you completely. And that's what I'm trying to say is that there are even people on the Russian side that understand that this is a horrible mistake. Whether you look at it from just pure strategy or politics, or whether you look at it at a human level, it's horrible on all sides. But we also need to understand that there are also nuances in terms of trying to figure out solutions. It's you know, we're not dealing with Gaddafi or just Saddam. We're dealing with you know, a nuclear powered state. We're dealing with you know, a total autocrat. So there's some very, very serious geopolitical issues that we have to be aware of. And so just saying that, trying to jump to conclusions about one way or the other, or what the solution is on the short term or the long term, we just need to be careful. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. I also can agree and add two things to that.
Mm-hmm.
First thing, most of Ukrainians do have relatives in Russia as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very common for Ukrainians to have at least distant relative, including myself. My father is Russian. He passed, but so it's not uncommon. Unfortunately, even when we try to call our relatives in Ukraine and explain them in Russia and explain them what's going on in Ukraine, it's dismissed, not believed, and talked about in a way that we deserve that. There is independent sociological research in Russia called Levada. Levada is named a foreign agent, so they definitely not sponsored by the state, but mostly targeted by the state. But they do produce at least credible research on the public opinion.
Right.
And according to Levada poll, recently they released 83% of people in Russia support war in Ukraine.
Right. Yeah. That's what's sad about the whole situation. No, it's absolutely right. It's what Putin is doing. It's not, he just calling him a crazy man doesn't solve it. This is a long historical problem that goes back, has very deep roots. You can, and I don't know how much you went into the history going back to the 15th century and so on. It's a complex history. And even going back to the Soviet and the Bolshevik era, recognizing, I think for us Americans, one of the things I've heard recently that I think is important for us, we don't hear this, is that much of the attitudes of Russians, not just Putin, but Russians about America goes back to in the Bolshevik Revolution, when the US was supporting the whites, the whites against the Bolsheviks. And some of that, of course, happened also during the Soviet era. So there are some really deep-seated misunderstandings and fears about Russia versus the rest of the world, and particularly about America. We need to understand if we're going to be helpful. And yeah, so I'm sorry about that, but
thank you, Bob. Thank you for your thoughts, and also thank you for letting us experiment with this method, both. That's very helpful. Now, Dana asks if we can go back to your family, and then Forrest has two people who want to make a question or ask a question or make a comment. Let's hear about your family.
So my family is in Poltava, where it's mostly so far it's been safe, but only an hour and a half from Kharkiv, where it's a hot zone where most of the Kharkiv has been destroyed. So now my nephew left. My family is very small. It's only my sister, my mom, and my nephew. We managed to get nephew out, but my mom and my sister stayed. My sister is a professor also at the university. So her university now is converted into a shelter for refugees from targeted areas. And so basically her job now is to go and feed the kids. So that's what she does now instead of teaching. So yeah, it's a lot of distraction, and my family likely is safe, but what's worth mentioning is that more than 10 million people now are displaced by this conflict. So 10 million people is the population of, say, Belgium. Belgium is 11, or Sweden. Sweden is 10. So it's a lot of displaced people. And it's very, very hard, I have a lot of people I assisted who are not family, but close friends. I help them to leave country, and it's heartbreaking to see how many people have to move and have to leave, and pretty much everybody I know, everybody left. Yeah, so not many people stay.
Thank you so much.
All right, just a second here. Okay, first of all, if you have a question, raise your hand electronically and I'll recognize you. But I do have Peter. Peter would like to ask a question. And Anastasia, I see you.
Some comments and then a question. We mentioned that you were born in Poltava. You didn't mention that this is a historical place.
It is a historical place.
And here happened one most important battle between Peter the Great and Charles the 12th of Sweden.
Yes.
That was a time when the emergence of Russia began to Europe.
Yeah, wow. Good knowledge, yes.
Another comment that I have is that when parts of Ukraine were united with Russia, Catherine II, the Empress, called this Nova Russia. And that at this time, Putin is trying to revive the old imperial policy, calling kind of Ukraine the Nova Russia too, not as an independent country.
Well, exactly. He even published this whole treaty, like 20 pages, on his position, and he basically said several times that Ukraine should not exist. It's not a state. It doesn't exist. It's a part of Russia. And so exactly on the same, so he has this revisionist history of Ukraine saying it never existed. It was always part of the Russia. It was always addendum to Russia. And so, yeah, and that's exactly his view. But it's also dangerous. Imagine somebody would say about either US or Canada that, you know, they never been a state because it was always part of UK, you know, and so how does that sound? So yeah, so that's exactly true. Yeah, and
My question is, how do you see, or if you see any role of Ukraine in the Holocaust? And vis-a-vis Bandera, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there was.
I know it's a kind of sensitive.
Yeah, so there was. It's not only Ukraine, because it was also at the time it was USSR in general, and Ukrainians. It's a complicated history where the potential, there was some participation in, and there was at that time there was a long-standing anti-Semitism, but it was not limited to Ukraine in general. It was very much prevalent throughout USSR in general. So it was more of a reflection, I would say, of the common sentiment at the time. But yes, it was a complicated history, but it's limited to that time. You know, I think it's important to distinguish what happened then during the USSR versus Ukraine as an independent state, which started in 1991, and whether or not anti-Semitism is a problem, or do we have that problem, or do we have the problem with, say, like far right, and you know, because that was one of the claims as well, that Ukraine has this far right groups, which is both of them, you know, are not true, you know. So, you know, the fact that we have a Jewish president, I think, says a lot. That, you know, we would way past of, you know, anti-Semitism as a country, and truly as a country, you know, we became independent in 1991, so that when we had to form identity and become who we are and not a part of USSR. So I think it's important to make those distinctions, what happened then versus happening now as a country. And also with the far right, you know, if you look, any country has a far right, including US. It's not limited to only Ukraine, but if you look different countries in Europe, so in France, far right had 30% of the vote. In I think Portugal was like about 17 or 20. So they're like, in Ukraine, they got 2.5% of the vote. So it's a very insignificant small minority that had never a say. We never had a far right. Well, we did, but it's not to the point of, say, France was 30% of the votes and sits in parliaments. So that narrative is also not true in terms of having a far right in Ukraine that is kind of ruling the place. You know, we never had that. We had a small insignificant 2.5% party that's never really gotten any recognition.
Right. I've got you on our list, Juan. Bronwyn, can you hear it?
Yeah, and it should be noted that Putin funds far-right groups all around the world. I agree with that, yes.
Yeah. Bronwyn, you're up.
Okay, thank you. Alex, thank you for this morning. It's been very helpful to hear from someone who really understands what's going on. Would you tell us a little bit about what you did to facilitate and work with your friend in LA who gave the, you know what I'm talking about?
Right. So, and that's actually something that I wanted to talk about and encourage. I think I would be disappointed to without talking about that. So since the beginning, when it started, first thing that you experience, people ask me, how do you feel? And it's uniform to all Ukrainians, feelings of powerlessness and hopelessness. Imagine, like you have to be on the news constantly, not because you care about the news, but because you really hope that your city is not destroyed, it's still there. And you really hope that your parents' house is still standing. That's why you're like obsessing about the news. It's fun. So that okay, no problem. So yeah, so the feelings, are also like trying to be on the phone with your family as much as possible, and when they don't respond to you, like in a sense of panic, they get hit, and then also imagine that seeing the places that you grew up in, that as your 5 fingers, that like the trees that you used to climb as a kid, the school you went to, and that all being completely erased and demolished. And then people that like represent the best of your country, they all live in, and it will set back your country for generations. All this happening in such a short time, so it caused a significant emotional turmoil to me, to anybody I know. And that's also one of the reasons potentially I left, because at least to get a sense of normalcy back, or some sort of functionality. But something else that helped me to get through this was I tried to get active, and I was trying to think what I can do to help. And besides going to protest and raise awareness, I connected to a group. So we have several Ukrainian organizations in Los Angeles. I live in Los Angeles. That came together to create a hub. And one of the organizations, part of this hub, but there is Ukrainian Cultural Center. There is an organization that organizes kind of like more activism and like signing petitions and trying to influence policies. And one of the organizations also, it's like equivalent of FedEx, but for Eastern Europe. So we all rely on them. Previous to war, we used to ship a lot of packages back home using them because they have amazing delivery system. It's the well-run machine. It's just like FedEx, but Ukrainian, Russian, and Azerbaijan, and basically all Eastern Europe, that they use that company. So the company rebranded now. Well, not rebranded. They said that they will stop targeted deliveries and they will focus on humanitarian aid. And they released a list of priorities, what was needed, and several things that were needed was, one was tactical stuff, includes tactical kind of medicine, something that can stop, like tourniquets and like high compression bandages and hemostatics, something that can use, in the battlefield to help people wounded. And also things like knee pads or, camos or boots, because it was so heartbreaking to see kids, like the new conscripts that were going to fight the war, and they literally used this, like the knee pads that they use for skateboarding, and they use normal clothes. There's nothing to give to them to help them, at least to protect their lives from being destroyed. And so, they needed, plate carriers, and preferably with plates to protect them from bullets. And we also need a lot of medicine because, again, Russia targeted a lot of hospitals. So hospitals were destroyed, and our ability to provide medical help was very, very limited. So there was a list of priorities on the medical side, what we need to deliver there, and also on the tactical side, things like camos. And so I tried to reach out, and I tried to think. I reached out to Dr. Hart, and Dr. Hart was able to donate several pallets from Global Health Institute that we already delivered to Ukraine. We had several planes now, but the first plane left LAX, cargo plane to Ukraine, loaded with all the equipment and a lot of medical equipment. But what also was interesting and kind of like experience that now you can see it in a lot of newspapers that talked about. I have a friend, he's in the industry, he's a stunt producer, but he's also a military veteran. And so I was trying to think, who do I know military veterans? So I remembered him and I was like, hey, do you have any, or do you know where I can get, like say, plate carriers or knee pads or cameras or something that can help save lives of soldiers, protect them from being killed on the field, especially those kids who now go, I was thinking about my nephew, because if he wouldn't leave, he would be one of those going also, potentially be killed. So he connected me to a Marine who is main consultant for Hollywood for anything military. So basically he trains all the actors to properly handle guns, to properly look like realistically. He coordinates all the war scenes. So basically if there is anything war or action movie in Hollywood that he would have hands in, it's one way or another. So we reached out to him and he was so excited about this initiative. So he had his own personal storage where he had about 1,000 uniforms, boots, knee pads, gloves, like fireproof, equipment so to protect people. And it was all real, because, it's not a butafore, so it's real. So he donated over $500,000 worth of his own equipment to go on the plane to Ukraine. And he still collects more from his friends, like boots and camo and things that so he's not collecting, we're not sending anything that, weapons or anything that helps people fight. We send stuff that protects their life when they are on the battlefield, and including also medical equipment as well. So I work with this organization, and if you want to support, and I hope if you want to support, this is one of the best ways to support local Ukrainian-run organizations, because what happens sometimes, you can see people try to support, say, like ADRA or which does amazing work, or Red Cross or international organizations. But in this war, it's a little bit better to support Ukrainian-run organizations on the ground, because we have our distribution networks, we have our connections, and we can guarantee that everything that is contributed goes towards the need and reaches the destination. Because, for example, Red Cross, I don't know if you heard about Red Cross in Ukraine and the issue with Red Cross. So Red Cross gathered a lot of funds and they never reached Ukraine, the International Red Cross. And to the point that Red Cross issued Ukrainian Red Cross issued the statement that we never received real support. And they now building, hospitals on the Russian side. So there's a little bit of that. With ADRA helps, and other supports also churches. And we also, I know a lot of people who try to support directly churches, which is great. But I think during the time of war, and I know it because I have my mom who's in the church, they do a lot of good work at church distributing funds, but they use it also as a form of slight missionary work. And during the war, missionary work coupled with humanitarian aid is a little bit ethically debatable, I would say. So that's one of the reasons I'm trying to encourage to support, the organizations that just send, medical equipment. And we send from Loma Linda, actually now, again, the supply chain donates a lot of medical equipment to go to hospitals. We have hospital in Lviv who serves as a distribution center. There are a couple of doctors, and they know locally which hospitals need help. So we deliver it to Lviv, and from Lviv it goes into the different hospitals to help people just, like things like central lines, or things that are just difficult to find now in Ukraine. So that's the organization I work with, and that's what I've been trying to do. And looking for supplies, looking for donations to send the next cargo plane, because cargo planes are expensive. And that's what we've been doing so far to help directly, to make sure that, and especially help with medical supplies and or tactical supplies to save lives.
Okay.
Alex, is there a website that I could put up on the chat for people if they want to do what you just suggested?
Yes, so it's the organization called Stand with Ukraine LA. I can put it in the chat. I don't know, there should be a website as well, or Ukrainian Cultural Center in Los Angeles. So Ukrainian Cultural Center is also a nonprofit organization. So, for tax deductible reasons, they can do. And any of these organizations, we both work together. It's like a hub, so regardless of which one of those you donate, if you mention it to delivery of help, it will go to that specific reason.
Maybe you can get the specifics.
Yes, I can.
And maybe you then can send an email to everybody.
Yes, yes.
Whatever.
Yeah, I can send you all the details.
That was my question. We have been helping from the refugee side. Because I'm saying how things to help the people in the country. I didn't know the way, and apparently you know the way, so we'll be very happy to know the details.
That will be the most impactful, important, because work. I was trying always to say work directly with Ukrainians, because we we have connections, and we're trying to do our best in all the Ukrainians now in the lake bonded together, and it was impressive to see like the volunteers. So we now use there's the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in LA, and now it became converted into like huge massive storage, so that's like distribution place. We have doctors, Ukrainian doctors who serve, who sort through the donations to prioritize them, to label them, and we regularly ship containers worth of help. UCLA has donated, Loma has donated as well. So we're trying to prioritize people trying sometimes to bring like Pampers or clothes. We don't take those because we try to prioritize like high priority medical help and tactical help to go directly to hospitals.
Okay, thank you so much, Alex. This brings to a conclusion the formal part of our program today and all that you have committed to. On the other hand, there are quite a few people on Facebook who would like, on Zoom who would like to continue this conversation. So maybe we can say we're formally over.
Yeah.
And then you can stay as long as you want.
Yeah. I see there's a question. Yeah. I see. I'm
Dana is trying to get.
Okay.
Dana.
Lord, thank you all. And you know what I'm just thinking? We changed the schedule to make it easier for people to go to First Church and come to here. I think we had to change it the other way. Maybe make it easier for them to go to Second Church, because it looks like that's where the Exodus is, right? So we should try this. Try this way for a bit, and then maybe we'll adjust to make it easier to go to Second Church. Start the first one earlier. In any case, we are groping our way through this. Thank you so much.
Well enjoyed.
Yeah.
And yes, if you could send.
I'll send the information a bit. I can put it quickly maybe in the chat as well.
Okay, those on I keep saying Facebook. Those on Zoom, let's jump in.
Yeah, I'm gonna. Can we? How do we keep it on for everybody? If we close our computers.
Well, if so long as one of them is on, it'll stay on. If we shut down, as we have on previous weeks, you shut down, I shut down, and as long as someone else is still there, they'll keep going.
Thank you so much.
But is Alex still going to be here?
Yeah. I'm here. Yeah. Happy to answer all the questions. I'm not leaving.
I'll see you at 4 o'clock at your house this afternoon.
Okay, let's see if we can get Dana. Looks like Dana wants.
That's south of the house. Good. Yeah.
If you can just hang on a little bit, we'll get this going.
Oh, yeah, she'll be there. Okay.
Forward to Dana.
Okay, I'm gonna,
Dana, can you hear us?
Are you talking with me? Okay, barely. So I had two questions. One is partially answered. What can we do besides donating? What can we do socially? How can we pursue our government or other governments to go into the right direction? And this is kind of the second part, because the first part of the question was, what do you think the Western governments should do? You know, I'm a little taken off by what's going on there. Okay. So what do you think the US government and other Western governments should do? Would be the right thing to do.
Dana, he's going to
As
answer
a-
your question, but they're fidgeting with the computer just now.
I can see that, so it's kind of stressing me out. I don't know if they can hear me or not. So
Yes, we're
maybe I
hearing you
should wait.
well. We're hearing you well. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
Just a second. I'll plug in my computer because I'm connected to the host. So I make sure that my battery doesn't die. Just a second.
Okay.
So maybe I should express the question in a different way. As a Ukrainian and as an ethicist, what do you think the US government should do right now? What is the right thing to do?
Okay,
And
Alex,
how
the
we
question
can
is,
help
what's the
them?
right thing for
Yeah, no,
the,
I hear the question.
Okay.
Okay. And I
And
just
I
want
think
to
he's
say
trying
that
to, I
I'm
think he's
from-
trying to set up, I think Alex is trying to get onto different channel. Just
Okay.
give him a little bit of time.
Okay, then no problem. I just wanted to say that, you know, I feel
Okay, there he
very
is.
deeply connected with the, you know, this story, as we are neighbors with Ukraine. I'm from Romania. And I have many of my relatives involved in helping refugees. And
Yeah. So now we have to. Are we going to shut this one?
shut down the other computers.
All right.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you. Thank you. And many blessings in your journey and projects.
Thank
We are
you.
still recording though.
okay, let's
Gonna turn that off.
Yeah, but there is no KGB here to go after us, so it's okay, even if we are recording.
Okay, everybody, we are learning how to do this. So Forrest is going to stop the recording.
We just need to shut down that one completely.
We're getting echo. It must be the KGC.
Right. Okay. Now it's good. Sorry. Now it's
That
good.
was a good one.
Now it's only my computer. So yes. So there are a few things I would say.
I'm going to interfere one more moment here. Go down here to the bottom. Stop